Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sukkah Daf Lamed Zayin contains one Mishnah. From the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah contains one brief Sugya, a brief discussion about Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that you have to use the four minim for schach. Then the Gemara moves on to a list of halachos that Rabbah said. Most of them Rava argued with, and the discussion was about chatzitza, whether or not something is a chatzitza between the different minim that are tied together in the lulav. Then we'll get to the Mishnah, which will introduce the topic of waving the lulav and how it's properly waved. When we say halal, which parts of halal, and what the motions are, and what the reason for the waving is. So let's begin. We have seen the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that you can only use for schach something which is part of the four minim of the lulav. The Gemara says it's true that Rabbi Yehuda really holds the way. We have a Mishnah we have a brisa which brings a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda about using boards of wood for schach. And the machlokes is not what we need to focus on. It's just that the brisa mentions that the boards are made out of erez. Erez is a cedar wood, and it says there that the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda was about if the boards are between 3 and 4 tefachim wide, are they puzzle or kosher? Rabbi Meir says they're puzzle. Rabbi Yehuda says they're kosher. Now, the brisa also says that if they're more than 4 tefachim, they all agree that it's kosher. If you leave spaces that are as wide as the boards are, they all agree that it's kosher. But we see from Meir that Rabbi Yehuda says you can make schach out of cedar wood. So obviously, it doesn't have to be one of the four minim. Cedar wood is not one of the four minim. So my answer is this is a type of cedar wood which is really hadasim. As a matter of fact, the Gemara quotes Rabba Bar Rav Huna, who says that there are 10 types of cedar, and many different trees are called cedar. Like we have a pasuk in Yeshayahu that says Etein Bamidbar Erez Shita Vahadas, and then the pasuk continues listing different types of plants that all count as erez. So you see that hadas counts as a type of cedar, and therefore he was referring to the hadas tree when he said you have planks of wood that are 4 tefachim wide. Okay, the Gemara now gets to the list of halachos of Rabbah, and it begins by quoting the statement of Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah that you have to tie the lulav branches with the hadas and arava with something that's made of those minim, and it mentions that the Akir Yerushalayim used to put a golden string around it that was not to hold it together, that was just for the decoration. So the Gemara now mentions a list of halachos of Rabbah. So Rabbah, first of all, says that he would tell the people who would prepare lulavim in the house of the Reish Galusa, they would tie the branches together. In the house of the Reish Galusa, he would say, make sure that you leave space for people to hold directly onto the branches, meaning whatever you're using to wrap around to hold the branches together should not take up the whole hand holding area. You should leave space for them to hold it directly, so that what you're holding should not count as a chatzitza. Now, the vast majority of these halachos here will be chatzitza halachos. Rabbah will say that something is chatzitza. Rabbah will say that does not count as a chatzitza. Chatzitza meaning of something interfering between two other things and blocking it. So here, Rabbah says what you're tying it is a chatzitza. People need to hold it directly in their hands, so you shouldn't tie the entire length of where you would hold the lulav. On that, Rabbah said, no, anything that's there for a design, for an ornament, is not chatzitza, and therefore they're allowed to hold it even if it's not part of the lulav, if it's just there for ornamental purposes. Okay, next halacha, Rabbah says, you shouldn't hold the lulav with a handkerchief around your hand. You shouldn't wrap the lulav in a handkerchief, which you may have soaked in water to keep it moist. You should not hold the lulav through that. You have to have your hand, again, in direct contact with it. And Rabbah says, no, this is not a problem. This is what we call l'kicha ayidei davar achar, holding something through another material. Rabbah says, that's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with holding something through something else. It's still called that you're holding the lulav. The Torah says, take a lulav. You're taking the lulav, so you're holding something else. It's not a problem. You're still holding the lulav itself. Now, Rabbah is going to bring 2 proofs. The first one will be rejected. 2 proofs, both from Paraduma, that holding something through another material is called holding. The first proof So the fact that the Torah says when you sprinkle paraduma water, you have to take in your hand a bunch of azov, a bunch of grasses. So you take that and you dip it in the water. So there's a Mishnah that says that when you're transporting the paraduma water, you have to make sure it stays tar. And they used to use a long tube, and the water would be at the bottom of the tube. So the branches, the grasses, couldn't reach the water. So the Mishnah says that they could tie a string around the branches and lower it down into the tube and pull it out. They would be able to dip the grasses in the water that way and pull it out. So says Rava, so you see clearly that the step of holding the grasses while you're putting it in the water is through something else. You're not holding it directly here, you're holding it via means of a string. Now the Torah there says Velokach, uses the same word velokach. There's a mitzvah of holding the grasses. So you see that the fact you're holding it through something else is not a problem. So here too, in holding the lulav, it's not a problem if you're holding it through a handkerchief. So the Gemara says, no, that's not necessarily a proof. Over there you connected the two. You tied them. You made them like one long thing. Here you're just wrapping it. Just wrapping, maybe that's a problem. So Rava therefore says, I'm going to bring you a different proof. And this is from a Mishnah which describes the halacha of putting the ashes of the paraduma into the water. So the halacha is that you had a stone trough and you filled it up with paraduma water, with special oil, and then you put the ashes of the paraduma into that. So you had to do an action of putting that water in there. It couldn't fall on its own. If it dropped in by mistake, it doesn't count. You have to put it in. So it says Rava, so you could make a diak here. If it dropped in by mistake without you intending for it to fall, it would be a problem. But if you poured it in while you were holding a container full of paraduma ashes, you poured it in without touching the ashes, without taking it in your hand and putting it in, that would be okay. How could that be? The Torah says, it says the same expression. You should take the ashes and put it in. You see, the fact that you're holding it through the container counts as if you're taking it. And it's not a problem, and this is the proof the Gemara accepts this, that lekicha, taking something through something else, does count as taking it. Okay, now we get to Rabba's next chatzitza halacha that Rava argues on. Rabba says you shouldn't tie the hadassim and ravas together and then jam the lulav between them. What's going to end up happening is you'll tear off some of the leaves. Now, he's not worried about the kashas of the hadassim and the aravos. He's worried about the fact that now you're going to have detached leaves trapped between the lulav and the hadassim and aravos, and those detached leaves will be a chatzitza, will block between the lulav and the other two, and that's a chatzitza, and we don't want any chatzitza, we don't want anything blocking between them. We want them to be snug and flush against each other. Rava says it's not a problem. It's min b'mina. Something doesn't block itself. If it's a hadas leaf, it doesn't block between the hadas and anything else, and if it's a rava leaf, it's not considered a blocking between the rava and anything else. Next halacha, Rava says, is let's say you already made the three branches tied it together, and you realize the lulav's too long. So you want to cut off the bottom of the lulav that sticks out below the arava and the hadas. The problem is if you chop it there, you can end up with some cut leaves, because you're going to cut the spine of the lulav, and the leaves that were connected below where you cut are now disconnected, but they're still wedged in between the lulav and the hadas and arava. So he says, again, it's chatzitza. And again, Rava says, min b'mina, it's not a chatzitza. Doesn't count as a chatzitza if it is from the lulav itself. Okay, this concludes the chatzitza halachos. The Gemara brings a few more halachos of Rava. Rava says that we know that something that's set aside to be used for a mitzvah, you're not allowed to use it for its other purposes that it may have had. Like you can't use the decorations of the sukkah or the wood of the sukkah for anything else on sukkahs. So says Rabba, a hadas that you set aside to use for the hadas is not allowed to smell on sukkahs because you set it aside from its previous function. Its previous function was for smelling. People generally use hadasim for good scent, and you took it out of that function and made it a mitzvah. However, he says in esrog you're allowed to smell on sukkahs because the function of an esrog is to be eaten, and you're setting it aside from its classic function. It means that you shouldn't eat it on sukkahs. So you definitely shouldn't eat it on sukkahs. Well, you know you're not going to eat it anyway because then you won't have an esrog. But you certainly are allowed to smell it because its main function is not called smelling. Now, Rabba says another halacha related to smelling of a esrogim and hadassim, and this is not on sukkah specifically. He says that on Shabbos you're allowed to smell a hadas that's growing. You're even allowed to smell any growing plant. We're not afraid that if you smell something that smells good, you're gonna accidentally be so inspired by the smell you want to take it home, you'll cut it off. that's not a problem. You don't need to worry about that. You're allowed to smell. However, a fruit, or growing fruit like an esrog, that you can't smell on Shabbos, because when it smells good, you may be overwhelmed with a desire to eat it, and then you'll either take a bite out of it or cut it off and then take it home, and that would be an isur d'oraisa of detaching a growing thing from the ground on Shabbos. Next halacha, Rabba says, is that when you hold the lulav of an esrog, the lulav goes in the right hand. Why in the right hand? So the Gemara explains, because it has more mitzvahs. It has 3 mitzvahs in one, while the esrog is just one. So you should hold it in the right hand. On that subject, the lessons of Rabbi Yirmiyah said to Rabbi Zrika, how come the bracha is called al netilas lulav? Why is it on the lulav, not on the esrog? So he said because the lulav is greater, which the word he used was gavoya, which means higher. So he thought he meant that it's taller. So he said, well, it's only taller because of its shape. Why don't you hold the esrog higher and then say the bracha on the esrog? So he explained, no, he didn't mean that it's higher. He meant that it has more mitzvahs involved, like we said earlier, and therefore the bracha should be on the lulav phrased and not on the esrog. Okay, now we get to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, when did they shake the lulav and esrog? So the Gemara says that the last chapter of Tehillim, which is part of Hallel, begins with Haidu and it ends with Haidu. So you shake it by both those Haidus, and you shake it by Ana Hashem Hashiana. And the Machlokes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai whether or not they also shook by Ana Hashem Hatzlichana. Beis Shammai says yes, Beis Hillel says no. And Rabbi Akiva said, even though Rabbi Akiva was from Beis Shammai, Rabbi Akiva says, I was watching Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua, and when everybody was shaking the lulav by Ana Hashem Hatzlichana, they were not. They only shook by Ana Hashem Hashiana. So the Gemara jumps in earlier. The Gemara says, who said anything about shaking? We were talking about the halachos of tying them together. Who said anything about shaking? The Gemara says, well, when we discussed the lulav, we said the size of the lulav, we said it has to have an extra tefach which to shake by. So once we were discussing shaking there, we discussed where the actual shaking is. Now, how does the shaking itself, how does it look? So the Gemara refers to the waving of the shtei halechem and the lambs, special kabbanos that go with the 2 loaves of bread on Shavuos. And over there, the Torah says to wave it. So the Gemara says you do all 4 directions, front, back, left, right, which is also could be said as northwest, east, and south, and up and down. Where do you see that? Because the Torah refers to waving of the milum. It says asher hunaf v'asher huram. Hunaf is the 4 directions. Huram means up and down. Huram means up, but Rashi says nothing can go up without first coming down. Now, says the Gemara, what's it for? Rabbi Yochanan says it's to show that you're doing the mitzvah, the shame for the kavanah, fulfilling the command of he who owns all 4 directions, and the sky and the earth, that's up, down in the 4 directions. Where it says that another opinion is that it's to block the bad winds from all 4 directions and bad dew, which would be a problem. It says, you see from here that even just a little piece of a mitzvah, part of a mitzvah which is not ma'akev, it's not a necessary part of the mitzvah, just an extra thing, still has the power to stop tragedies and trouble from occurring, because here, this part, the waving, which is not even a necessary part of the mitzvah, is able to stop the bad winds and the dew from occurring over here. Now, he had said that about korbanos. Rava says the same thing applies by a lulav. The waving of certain korbanos is also not ma'akev. Now, the Gemara says that Rav Acha bar Yaakov, when he used to wave it, he would say, this is a poke in the eyes of the Satan. Says the Gemara, you should not say that. There's no reason to start up with the Satan for no reason and be migari Yetzirah, and therefore we do not say that.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.